go into each of these blow by blows. I actually didn't even have to write this on the board. In the conceptualization phase, in the design phase, in the data collection phase, in the analysis phase, in your reporting phase, every aspect of and every phase of your research, you should be factoring into account ethical considerations, so that the assumptions that you make initially might not pan, right? They might not translate to some of the findings that you found, and you need to be able to justify and legitimize these discrepancies, both methodologically, but also ethically, right? In the beginning of my research, I thought it was a good idea to ask this type of question. However, after interviewing 20 participants and recognizing that the attempt to answer the question evoked a very bitter, very remorseful response that I later regretted, I now recognize that that question might have been misplaced. So, caution to future researchers doing this type of research: this type of question will probably elicit a negative response. So that once that information is out there, it's just like the scientific method. Despite the fact that we're social scientists, it doesn't mean that we don't follow the same sort of paradigmatic unfolding of the process of gathering and collecting and assessing data, right? We collect data, we make our assumptions, we need to test, and there has to be a sense in which our findings are reproducible. If I say that this is going to happen and this is my experience, I put that out there. Other social scientists do similar research and they say, no, Dr. Campbell's right. I had roughly the same experience in my interviews with my participants. We then have a better understanding of, I don't believe in this, I hate the word completely, but human nature, whatever that might be, right? There is a sense in which humans, having experienced this type of phenomena, generally will have this sort of intellectual, existential, more importantly, existential relationship to the experience, phenomenological relationship to the experience, right? So that we can't make generalizations across the board, which is why I don't believe in human nature, but that's an aside. But generally speaking, this is what humans might act like given circumstance X. Okay, so the idea is that we have to factor ethical decisions into our research process from the very beginning, conceptualization phase, until the report of our findings. That's that. Okay, next, influences on researchers' definition of social reality. I actually personally like this section. So this is the influence on definition of social. So the influence on the definition of social reality. Okay. Now that in the last section I just spoke about in the bit on 3 ethical considerations for social science, I spoke on the idea of accountability, and we recognize that accountability is a small aspect of a much larger discourse on epistemology and epistemological considerations. To be technical, epistemological ethical considerations. Hopefully that makes sense. A theory of knowledge which discusses how we should conduct ourselves, so the combination of ethics and epistemology. We can talk about epistemological perspectives. So in 1A, we recognize, and I'll talk about the epistemological perspective in a second, if we're going to talk about the definition of social reality, right, and this reality is in scare quotes because I don't personally believe in human nature. Your professors might or might not. It doesn't matter, it's my lecture. So, the idea that all human beings have some natural disposition to interpret the world, I'm against. The idea that all human beings, insofar as they're humans, have certain physiological constructs is quantifiable, is accessible. A, serve to frame researchers' theoretical orientation, right? Now let me explain this. My definition of social reality is going to frame the way in which I conduct my research, right? Serve to frame the researcher's theoretical orientation, right? So the idea is as researcher, theoretical orientation as researcher, theoretical orientation is going to frame the way in which I define social reality. I'll say that again. My, as researcher, theoretical orientation, the way in which I think and process information about the world, from the world, is going to frame the way in which I discuss and analyze and assess social reality. Now, I can't get into the really technical bits, but for those of you who just are like me, complete freaking addicts for knowledge, I've done I don't know how many maybe 8 to 10 hour series on Saussurean semiotics. I can't get into the full discourse on that now at all. Those of you who are interested, just go to my main page and look for semiotics and watch the series in your own time. The idea is this though. I'll give a similar, very simple, we'll do a little ghetto philosophy before we get complicated. Remember, we're talking about epistemological perspectives, right? And we recognize that my epistemological perspective as a researcher is going to frame the way in which I conduct research. Very technical, but what does that mean? Well, it means, imagine that I grew up in the ghetto, right? Imagine that I grew up in the ghetto, to varying degrees. And insofar as I grew up in the ghetto, I had certain experiences of life in that situation. If I am taken out of that situation, that formed the way in which I process information and placed into a new situation, I'm immediately going to be able to make contrast between the things that I thought were descriptors of a reality and wow, everybody mows their lawn. You know, you'll get in trouble if you don't edge your grass. I mean, what does that mean? You'll get in trouble if you leave your garbage can out in the front of the house for an extra day after garbage pickup. I mean, okay. I won't be able to conduct myself, right? I won't be able to conduct myself appropriately if taken from one situation into another situation because I have not been habituated by the rules of conduct for this new social reality. So, I don't want to get too deep with this, but I do want this is incredibly important. This is incredibly, incredibly important. And I would even say this is not just a sort of a novice researcher error. The best researchers make generalizations that fail to recognize this distinction. It is not justifiable. Remember, we're talking about accountability, right? So, and epistemological relationships between the researcher and the subject. It is not fair, right, to make assessments for someone who has been relocated, either conceptually, mentally, physically, relocated to a situation where they have not yet adapted to the social norms. The social norms in the ghetto versus the social norms in the suburbs are two different social norms. It's not that one's better or one's worse. There are ethical modes of conduct and rules of conduct in the ghetto. There are ethical modes of conduct and rules of conduct in the suburbs, many of which overlap, some of which don't. The problems arise not in those modes of conduct that do overlap. The problems arise in those modes of conduct that do not overlap. Since we recognize that those modes of conduct that do not overlap are going to be conflictual, now we can anticipate conflict, right? And as a conflict resolutionist and a philosopher primarily, I'm a philosopher that does conflict resolution. As a conflict resolutionist, I recognize immediately conflict insofar as an individual, it's called an intersectionality of identity. I don't want to get into this now. I had a fabulously genius, shout out to Nia, graduate student who's now tenure track assistant professor, who did phenomenal research on gender identity and this notion of intersectionality. Because my identity as ghetto, my identity as lesbian, my identity as black, my identity as homosexual, my identity as soldier, my identity as instructor conflates when I step out of an arena that recognizes my identity and I have to behave in this new framework. So soldiers who leave the battlefield to come back to civilian population after having different rules of conduct, it's hard for them to readjust to civilian life, as an example, because their identity is still tied to being a soldier. But if my identity is still tied to being a soldier and I'm told that I need to behave in this different way, now I'm having identity problems, right? I'm having an identity conflict.